First of all, I was a pretty average student in high school. Prior to that, I guess on my English language skills, maybe because of watching those foreign films that I watched when I was growing up, that a lot of other kids didn't have access to, I was pretty good at certain subjects, but it didn't really reveal itself until I was in junior high school, how my math and science scores weren't really very good. I was not able to go to the Bronx High School of Science, which was right up the street, because the teacher I had, a really mean, terrible guy, did not allow me to take the test. I didn't realize at the time that he really couldn't do that. But he was either protecting me because I wouldn't have done well there, and I probably wouldn't have, or as we all suspected, he was limiting who could take the test and who didn't, because he wanted a high percentage of his kids getting into the Bronx High School of Science, where I would have been miserable. I would have not been able to do the work. When I get to Clinton High School, it's the same thing. It emerges like a rash that you didn't think you were going to have, where I'm just fumbling through math and science. I took a class, they called it Idiot's Algebra. Idiot's Algebra was intermediate algebra spread out over a year rather than one term for those who were very slow in getting it. So I took that, and then the issue became, well, where am I going to go to college? And I was going to go to college, and in my family I was now living in an apartment with my mother. My sister was married, and it was brought up to me in no uncertain terms that I couldn't go to an out-of-town college because I would be leaving my mother alone, which seemed like a startling thought, but nonetheless that was my responsibility. And I made a series of assumptions that I wasn't good in math, so I couldn't be an engineer, and there were many people going into engineering then. We're in the mid-50s. A couple of my best friends went into engineering schools, and I wasn't good in science, so I wasn't going to be a doctor. I didn't like memorizing, so I wasn't going to be a lawyer. So I put all of that together with my 16-year-old thinking and said, well, I'll go into business. I'll go to a business school. And I applied to and was accepted at the undergraduate business school at NYU, and that is where I went, and was pretty miserable there as well. And ended up working as the business manager of the school newspaper, and that kind of saved my college years. I was happy doing that. It became basically what going to school was all about, and eventually I went on into the business world for a while. What I thought I would do, because I was good in the advertising courses, was go into advertising, and that seemed like a really sophisticated field to go into. What I had no idea about was how much anti-Semitism existed in the advertising agency business in the mid-50s. It was really tough. There were perhaps 2 advertising agencies, and some of this I learned after the fact, who might have hired someone who was Jewish, one being Gray Advertising and the other Doyle Dane Bernbach, and they were not taking students from NY Jew, as the school was called in those days. They might have been taking kids who went to Bucknell or other schools like that, or even an Ivy League school, which was somewhat unlikely. But I did not have a shot at getting into an advertising agency when I got out of school, and I had pretty good college credentials. Jerry Della Femina, who became a famous advertising copywriter and then executive, told me some years later that, and he followed me, so things were even breaking a little better for him. It was getting better after I went through the system. He went for a job on a motor account. J. Walter Thompson had the Ford count, I think they were looking for, and he was told, oh, they don't want your kind. So it extended as well, not only to Jewish people, but to an Italian American in his case. There was a lot of prejudice. It was really an old boy WASP kind of network. And I stumbled out of NYU thinking I would get a job as an advertising agency copywriter, and I couldn't get arrested. I kicked around looking for a job, and finally ended up working in my first job for a couple of trade magazines in their promotion department, writing ads for companies that didn't have their own advertising agencies. It was so far from the agency world, but it was writing advertising copy. Then I went into the Army. When I came out, I got a job in the sales promotion department of Ziff Davis magazines, which these jobs were like a ghetto for Jewish kids who wanted to write advertising but couldn't get jobs with advertising agencies. You could make a career in it in sales promotion. And then at the time, a guy I was working under had a pal who had a job doing exactly what I was doing at a higher level at McCall's magazine. And this friend told me that he had left the job because he wrote a novel. And that was Joe Heller. And the novel was Catch-22. So that was very influential for me, not for the book, of course, which I loved, but for the idea of it, because it sent a message to me that what I was doing, I didn't have to do this. I was already showing some interest in doing other kinds of writing. I was writing lyrics for songs on the subway going to work, and I was thinking of doing things like that. And then, fortunately, I was fired in an economic setback, and I didn't go back to work ever again in a formal job. I started freelancing, doing a series of different things, and eventually wrote my first novel. And then by the time I had done that, there was no turning back. They wouldn't have taken me in advertising even if I wanted to go. Well, I don't know if I've been directly influenced by growing up in the Bronx as being a writer. I think any influence has been that the schools were so good, the public schools were so good, that my training, if you will, or my education from the lower grades all the way up through high school in English was so solid that I was able to withstand the deficit of going to a pretty weak college in the NYU School of Business that I went to. So it was as though, well, the best way to put it is my last term in high school, the English class that I had at Clinton High School was better on a higher level than any English college class I took at NYU. So I think that's what I got out of it. In terms of the influence, I'm not sure. You'd have to go deep into my psyche to find out that maybe my background was something that I was looking to overcome, and maybe being a writer was something that I found my way into to overcome my background. That's my background in my family. That's not necessarily the influence of the Bronx. I think of that as benign and really quite wonderful, actually.